Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
At Evernorth Health Services, we believe costs shouldn't get in the way of life-changing care, and we're doing everything in our power to make it possible. Behavioral health solutions that also keep your projections at their best? It's possible. Pharmacy benefits that benefit your bottom line? It's possible. Complex specialty care that cares about your ROI? It's possible. Because we're already doing it. All while saving businesses billions. That's Wonder made possible. Learn more at evernorth.com/wonder.
The Biden administration in Washington has definitely been pushing electric vehicles for some time. In fact, they've been in competition with Canada on that front. But just recently, they announced that they were going to impose a 100% tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles. What's the reasoning behind that? What does it mean for Canada's industry? What does it mean for Canadian consumers? That's what we're going to talk about today on the Full Comment Podcast. Hello, my name's Brian Lilly. This is the Full Comment Podcast. And today, a guest who knows all about the auto industry, inside and out. It's Flavio Volpe. He is the president of the Auto Parts Manufacturers Association of Canada. He is someone who has been at all of the big announcements that you've seen with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, with Ontario Premier Doug Ford, regarding investment in the EV sector in this country. But Flavio, well, first off, thanks for the time. But I want to start with this Biden move. It surprised me a little bit. There was a 25% tariff on electric vehicles coming out of China. Now it's going to 100%. What's the reasoning?
It may not be enough, to be honest. We're dealing with a geopolitical adversary who's been preparing for the last couple of decades to put themselves in a position to have advantages in advanced manufacturing over the Western sphere. They do it with cheap and sometimes forced labor. They do it with environmental regulations be damned. And
by that you mean they either don't have them or they ignore them.
Well, they're very clever. They have them. And then when the national interest is at play, like, hey, by the way, let's build a plant for Tesla in Shanghai and get it up and running within a year. Well, we're not really worried about local regs and environmental concerns and displacement of other interests. So just boom, get it done. They've invested quite heavily in all the raw materials and primary materials that go into making cars, and so they are the world's leaders in cheap steel and cheap aluminum and cheap lithium and cheap rubber and cheap everything. And so they put together cars that the West taught them how to build over the last 20 years, and big joint ventures with companies like Volkswagen and Stellantis and General Motors and
Tesla.
Now they're ready to flood. Yeah, and Tesla. Now they're ready to flood the market with cars. I talked to someone today who said, "Oh, well, why shouldn't we have access to that BYD vehicle that's $15,000?" And I said, "Well, why don't you ask yourself why it's $15,000? That's not even the price of the battery. Who are you getting into bed with?"
So there's a phrase that you used just a moment ago that I want you to expand upon. You said advanced manufacturing. Now, we've known for a long time that China has used their industrial might to ship over all kinds of manufactured products for us. Right? Try going shopping for any kitchenwares. You need something for your kitchen. You need a new mixing bowl. You need a utensil. You need a small appliance. You need baking sheet. It doesn't matter. It's going to be hard to find something not made in China. Even the big European brands on things like knives have lower tier versions of their products made in China. But that's low-end manufacturing. Explain why it's important about the advanced manufacturing.
Well, they learned over the last 25, 30 years how to be efficient at volume manufacturing on very specific items, all the knickknacks that we all need to live a functional life, the kind of stuff that you run out to Walmart for, the commoditized goods. In our business, we call them the one-shot molds, They got really good at making the molds to make the plastic goods, or the tools to make the metallic goods. But they invested quite heavily in electronics, complex sub-assemblies like electric motors. All those toys and those ceiling fans that you bought all have motors in them, and an electric motor is a rather simple device. You've got reverse polarity and an electromagnet and a rod in the middle and a casting. It's not too different, the motor that is running in your electric vehicle than is running in the toys you played with when you were growing up. They positioned themselves well for the West to outsource as much of the manufacturing that we could to drive costs down in an uber competitive, market-driven global economy. They learned from us. They learned that we did not have the raw materials required to feed the beast. That's plastics, metals, rare earths, critical minerals. And they had them. They learned that we take 8, 12, 15 years for some approvals because, we have not just economic stewardship here. We have environmental stewardship, community stewardship. You're going to do a major mining project of any kind in Canada. There's lots of steps, including dealing with Indigenous communities and affected communities. So they said, well, what if we threw the state behind just getting it done in China? We've got some veins of lithium on this plot. Just get the excavator out. Get the rocks out.
I not to be flippant, but
sure.
If China discovered that there was valuable minerals under a specific village, I would see them moving the entire village just to get at them.
Yeah, they have a history of doing what they need to do to focus on their objective, which is affecting the global balance of power, becoming the world's most important superpower. They're, in the past, you do gunboat diplomacy. Here, what they've done is it's economic extortion in some cases, giving you cheap money and cheap goods, putting their money in their, infrastructure initiatives around the world in places where, unfortunately, the U.S. and the West pulled out after the Soviet era ended. And Chinese money has flown into Africa, it's flown into Central America, it's flown into Eastern Europe and all over South Asia. And they are more focused than we are because it isn't about cars for them. It certainly isn't about clean cars for them. It's about affecting the global balance of power in their favor. And we naively walked into the buzzsaw that we ordered at a cheap price.
Now, in terms of global balance of power, just being dominant in manufacturing is simply part of that, correct? So, yeah, this is part of a long-term plan. It's not just about being dominant in the EV sector, although that's the current discussion we're having. It's about being dominant everywhere, having control.
Yeah, that's right. I think they, I don't want to moralize and fault them for wanting to have a preeminent position. I'm certainly not naive to the fact that that's what they're looking for. When we, let's say, for example, as everything digitizes around the planet, goods, the way they interact, security, everything else, one of the core products is semiconductors. And we've had a semiconductor crisis over the last couple of years brought on by the global pandemic. But we all rely, both in China and in the West, on an incredible cluster of semiconductor manufacture in Taiwan, which is a hotly contested subject in Beijing. Is Taiwan a Chinese province, or is Taiwan, as the West says, its own country? We are all vulnerable, both sides of the equation, to, if we lost access to Taiwanese semiconductors before we build up our own capacity, we'll all have a problem. The machines you and I are using to talk to each other are dependent on that capacity. Well, look at how China is acting geopolitically with Taiwan. Look what they did with Hong Kong during the pandemic. They're no longer worried that the Americans might send the 7th Fleet through the Taiwan Strait. They are forcing recognition around the world that maybe China does have a point. Maybe the Taiwanese are with them. They've got Joe Biden last year saying, well, if the Chinese invaded Taiwan, they would be met militarily by the U.S., and then the White House walking that back in a week. That's power. That's the growth of Chinese soft power based on the strength of the Chinese economic power. We are indebted. The world is indebted to this Chinese base, and we act differently.
And so they've got this new car. So Canada, the United States, in the middle of revamping to the future electric model. And we'll talk about the controversy around that, because I know some listeners are yelling as they're listening to you and I talk, EVs don't work. I'm never going to drive any. And we know all that. We'll get into that in a minute. But let's just look at it from a geopolitical point of view still. And, over the weekend, a piece moved on the wires from Associated Press that was just glowing about the $12,000 US, or about $16,000 Canadian, Seagull by BYD. That's the $15,000 odd vehicle that you mentioned earlier. And they've got a cheaper one for shorter range that costs under $10,000 US. And they're talking about how beautifully it's made and it's wonderful. These are vehicles that China is literally making to flood the world market. There was a story in Le Monde out of Paris last week about how Antwerp, the port in Antwerp in Belgium, is just flooded with these vehicles, and some of them will sit there for a year. And why are they there? Because China has a goal of achieving 25% minimum of the European electric vehicle market. And so they're subsidized. Like, why are the cars so cheap? Because the government is subsidizing them. And they want us to be beholden to them for our future vehicles and our future manufacturing.
Yeah, it's the old, I grew up at a time when we said, say no to drugs. And, all the different PSAs of like, your pusher's going to give you some for free. The first one's on me. Well, that's what this is. How does a vehicle that has the same dimensions and presumably meets the same crash and safety standards and standards on the chemistry and the metallurgy cost less than the bill of materials for the competition? People don't ask themselves what they're getting in return in exchange for this deal. And, that's a typical consumer. Look, we're in tough times. Money's tight. The cost of money's high. If you can relieve some of my burden, I'll take it. And that's what they're doing. They're putting that out on offer. These aren't, I keep listening to people. I've done a bunch of interviews the last few days where they say, well, the environmental lobby says this is really good for the environment. And you're just an automotive lobbyist who is trying to help the fat cats keep eating. And I represent a business where the profit margins are in the low to mid single digits, and who are beholden for electronics, for raw materials to the Chinese already. And we have a very healthy regulatory environment here in Canada and the U.S. The rules are very straightforward, and you can't break them without major penalty. And we're up against China Inc. These are state-owned enterprises who are saying, "Hey, by the way, well, you guys are being naive. I just sold your family and friends a vehicle that's going to put you out of business."
So you have been. I mentioned off the top that you've been at all the big EV announcements with Prime Minister Trudeau, with Ontario Premier Doug Ford. You've lobbied for the EV sector in this country. I'm not calling you a fat cat lobbyist like those critics, Flavio, but
I used to be skinnier, but yeah. Thank you.
So did we all.
Yeah.
But you've been at these events and you've been supportive, but now you've been critical of the Trudeau government's policy on how fast we have to go to electric vehicles because you've said that it's going too fast. Is your worry that we're all going to run out and buy these BYD or other Chinese vehicles that are cheap and cheerful and will get the job done, but then you're kind of locked into it? It's like when you choose your phone, is it Apple or is it Android? And then you're locked into that system. And then when you go to replace it, well, you're going to replace it with what already exists. And so, the Trudeau government has spent a lot of money, time, and capital trying to attract investment here. And yet they're turning around and bringing in regulations that will, if it goes through, force us all to buy a Chinese product before the Canadian product's ready.
Yeah, that's at the core of it. And, I think people know me as championing the EV manufacturer in Canada, but I want to be specific. I'm a car guy. I am championing the auto industry in Canada. The governments around the world and then car makers around the world have said, governments have said, we've got to go to zero emissions, and there are no exceptions. And car makers around the world said, yep, we'll do it faster than you, and we'll do it faster. They all lined up to do it. In Canada, we don't have a Canadian automaker. We make 2 million cars here, but those are companies that are headquartered in Tokyo and Detroit and Paris. And so I represent the part suppliers who supply all this production. And what we've said to the government is we can only make what the car makers order. And we have constantly pitched our latest technologies, lightweighting, high voltage. Some of the powertrain suppliers said, "Well, we make engines for you. We can make motors for you." We built Project Arrow, and some of your listeners might know about that. ProjectArrow.ca. We built a 100% Canadian car except for the screens. I couldn't get screens from anywhere but China. Bumper to bumper, working prototype to highlight the entire landscape of Canadian technology that can serve the world's EV supply chain. But the government's been very good in supporting, all these announcements that you talk about. Industry, Canada, and finance have really said, okay, fine. We would like the people who are making cars here now and supplying cars and assembling them and doing the raw materials, those Canadians, to be the Canadians that make EVs. Let's just help those companies transition. But the environment department has said, oh, well, let's force the market to. Let's say 100% of the sales in Canada by 2035 must be electric. And if you're a car company that doesn't meet the 20% goal by 2026 or 60% goal by 2030, every vehicle that doesn't meet the threshold, you're going to pay a $20,000 fine, whether you make cars in Canada or not. If you sell cars into Canada, like VinFast from Vietnam or Tesla from Shanghai, not Texas, and they're electric, but you have no Canadian content on it and you have no investment in Canada, but you meet that threshold or exceed it, we'll give you a $20,000 credit.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. And so
I don't think people know that that's what we're talking about. So
it's crazy.
So someone like, a company like General Motors has been in Canada for 115 years or so?
Yeah, that's more. Right. Yeah.
And so if they don't meet that threshold for every car sold in Canada, so maybe they sell 100,000 cars above the threshold, that's going to be $20,000 a car.
Yeah. Look, the numbers for a company like that or a company like a Toyota, they make 300,000 cars or 400,000 or 500,000 cars a year here. They sell about the same. So let's say the target is 20% by 2026, and you've sold 300,000 cars here, but you only sold 45,000 electric vehicles because Canadian consumers didn't buy them, you're short 15,000. Well, 15,000 times 20,000 is a $300 million fine for a company that also makes cars here. Now, if you make those electric cars here and Canadians don't buy them, but you sell them to Americans, so 80% of the cars that we make in Canada are sold to Americans, you don't get a credit for the battery electric vehicle you made in Windsor that got sold a kilometer away in Detroit. But VinFast, that makes cars in Vietnam, who sold a modest 2,000 here last year, well, we're going to give them 2,000 times 20,000 in credits. Here's $40 million that you got for being green, I guess. BYD, if they sold 50,000 of these $12,000 cars or $15,000 cars, we would give them $1 billion in credits so that they could sell them.
But hold on.
Yeah,
you said they will get $20,000 per car sold. That's more than the car costs.
It's crazy, Brian. It's not. There's no. If it sounds crazy, trust me, I do this every day, all day long. It doesn't make sense. I'm not getting it wrong. You can have the Minister of the Environment on. You can have Transport Canada on, who
Stephen Guilbeault and I have not been on good terms in a very long time, so that's not going to happen.
Well, here, let me give you another example that will make people crazy. There's a $5,000 purchase incentive available from the federal government if you buy an electric vehicle here in Canada. Okay, the province of Ontario doesn't have it; some other provinces do. To qualify for that, you just have to buy an electric vehicle as long as it's under $55,000. Doesn't matter where it comes from. Well, last year, Transport Canada, that runs the program, spent $130 million in incentives on cars made in China. I mean, that's insane.
135 million?
130 million of dollars generated by Canadian citizens and companies in the tax base paid out to cars made in China. And you'll have people who say, I've been arguing with them for the last 2 days now since Biden made his news here. People on the environmental side, we need those electric cars, devil be damned. And well, okay, so we're going to give cash to China. And we're going to ignore the fact that China makes these cars in the dirtiest industrial environment on the planet, so that you can virtue signal in your neighborhood. By the way, they said the argument has been, otherwise electric vehicles are just luxury goods, and this is a discretionary purchase. Every vehicle is a discretionary purchase. If you're naive enough to think that we should all lay down for Chinese manufacturing, I really don't know where to start the argument. If you tell me that you have lower disposable income and you need a cheaper option, I really understand that. I truly do. But it's not up to the consumer to decide. They're not equipped to decide. That's not the job we pay them to do, to understand balance of power politics between the U.S. and China and where Canada should sit. And Canada absolutely should sit inside North America.
You're talking about these rebates that the feds give out and different provinces give out. My big problem, and I come at this from a particular point of view. All of us have our biases. We all have something in our background that informs our decisions. I come from Hamilton. It's a steel town. Food on my table was a result of selling steel to auto manufacturers, right? And so I never understood why the previous Wynne government in Ontario, and Ontario is the big manufacturing hub. Why were we giving out subsidies to cars made in China and elsewhere before we ever had? She never put anything into trying to attract the EV manufacturing. Just said, we'll subsidize you to buy a Chinese car. And I thought, this is the craziest thing. We're undermining our own industry. And I guess that's kind of the theme of the whole discussion that we're having today.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what? When Doug Ford formed government here, in our first meetings, I said, the purchase incentives, I know they're really popular with enthusiasts. And let's put enthusiasts aside. I represent the the people who make parts for cars or assemble these cars in Canada, they are a secondary priority. Once you take the money that you're spending on, and that was at that time up to $14,000 for, if you wanted to buy a Porsche 918 Spyder for $975,000, we'll give you $14,000 off. We said, take that money, invest it in the manufacturing footprint for those vehicles. In Hamilton, ArcelorMittal Dofasco sells $5 billion worth of steel to the local automotive sector here in Canada and in the Great Lakes region. Ask them about the practices of Chinese steel, steel dumping, steel that comes through other countries, the predatory pricing on it. The Chinese sell finished goods out of steel for their selling price is less than the spot price of the raw material here. How? It didn't come in from outer space. It means somebody else paid the bill, and that's really corporate China.
I remember when Donald Trump was in the White House and he had an issue with Chinese steel coming in through Canada.
Yeah.
We'd give it a quick polish, try and send it to the States as Canadian steel. And he said, you got to stop doing this. For a year, he said, just got to stop doing this. Our government refused. He put tariffs. And I was like, guys, of course he's going to do that. Like, why are you protecting Chinese steel coming in to the point where it hurts our homegrown industry? But anyways, you've mentioned the issue of manufacturing and the supports from the Trudeau and the Ford governments. That's been controversial. That I've supported it, but I'm going to play devil's advocate when we come back after this break. So, Flavio, the idea that the federal and provincial governments of Ontario are going to back the EV manufacturing sector in this country has been incredibly controversial. First off, let's deal with the opening part. The number of times I hear from people, EVs won't work, EVs don't work, this is just a boondoggle. What do you say to them?
I mean, a lot of people have a lot of strong opinions about technology. It's a little strange, to be honest. The technology isn't brand new. I mean, in the 1910s, the New York City Cab Company ran electric vehicles. They're batteries, lead acid batteries that they had that they bought from Japan. It's a story as old as the industry. The cars are a superior experience. I think what people are upset about is a few pieces. Number one, this is a country whose economy relies heavily on a healthy oil and gas sector. I think we lose sight of that in central and eastern Canada, but a lot of the bills get paid by what happens in Alberta specifically, but also in Saskatchewan. And when you power a vehicle with electricity, you're not powering it with the products that are currently helping to pay the bills and employ people in good paying jobs and careers. And so they look at EVs as a threat, and it's certainly understandable. I won't moralize over that. I've always said maybe the best partners we should have are the balance sheets of the oil and gas companies to help pay some of these bills so they don't go through Ottawa and then back out. Everybody's going to have to transition. The only debate is how long. And then the other thing is, people get really sanctimonious about EVs, and they say, well, you've got to do your part for the environment. And then they are the same people who the last couple of days are really upset that Joe Biden might say, look, let's even the playing field. If you want cheap Chinese cars, then you're going to have to pay a little bit more for it. And then they lose their minds and ignore the fact that the Chinese are the top polluters in the world. And so they listen to that sanctimony. It's easier to...
We're still exporting coal to China. We're part of the problem. And they're building a coal-fired plant a week.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I think that Canada is in a position, and the reason why I like the transition to EVs, I don't like the schedule that we have on it. I think it's unrealistic. 100% by 2035 will never happen. You and I will do this podcast as old men then, or whatever we'll do in 2035, maybe like a hologram or something. And the number will be 35 or 40%. But I do think that, the Canadian, so EVs are driven by batteries. Batteries are driven by chemistry that is able to hold and discharge power efficiently. And that comes from lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite. We have that in Canada. We don't have it ready. It's going to be 10 years before it's ready. But if that's the biggest expense in an EV, a battery might be a $25,000 product. And we have it, and the Americans don't, and the Germans don't, and the Japanese don't. We may be able to, on a mid to long-term play, become an outsized player in the most lucrative and strategically important consumer good in the world. But these are complicated. These are complicated objectives, and the Chinese have taken 30 years to get there with a centrally planned economy. It's going to take us a lot longer to get there, and I think we all have to start listening to each other a little bit more and stop being sanctimonious on both ends of the debate. We are going to move from fossil fuels, but we're going to move in the next 40, 50 years, and we are going to go to zero emission transportation, and we may lead it. But if we rush the market there before it's ready, it's going to buy from the Chinese that are 10 times, 100 times the risk on CO2s than anything that we're doing in Western Canada.
And so at that point, we're rewarding people who are polluting more than what we're trying to replace.
Yeah, I sat down with the CEO of a supercar company in Italy. I won't tell you which one, but it's got a horse on the front. And he said to me, "What do you think? What do you think about all this?" And I said, "Well, I think you have to develop a product that is zero emissions. I mean, you're a responsible company that's publicly traded." I said, "But by the time we get to 2028, 2029, and all of these countries fail against their targets, they're going to recalibrate what the actual target is. It's going to be CO2 emissions on your entire company footprint, not just your cars. And so buy your steel in Quebec or your aluminum in Quebec because it's driven by hydroelectric. Get your lithium in Northern Ontario, and try to put yourself in a good position." And his reflection to me is, this feels a little bit like, let's sweep the dirt off the floors in our house and put it outside and then say it's all clean. The dirt still exists. If you're going to go buy you're going to buy cheap, clean cars from dirty jurisdictions, you just put it outside the door. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means you close the door on it, but everybody else can see it.
The other critique of what Trudeau and Ford have been doing in terms of the Stellantis deal, the Volkswagen deal, now the Honda deal. And I know the Honda deal is it's organized very differently. But, that's lost on a lot of people. But so is the fact that money has not been handed to these companies yet. So I'm constantly asked, why are we giving them $13 billion and they haven't built a car yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is a really simple one. Unlike in 2010 when we bailed out General Motors and Chrysler then at the time, where we wrote a check, Canada wrote a check for $13.7 billion. It was like, here's a check, fingers crossed, I hope you survive. I think it was the right decision, by the way. I think we don't give enough credit to Stephen Harper and Dalton McGuinty for that, but we saved the industry and tens of thousands of jobs. Now what we've done is we made a commitment to companies like Volkswagen, Stellantis, said, if you make these goods at this volume in these years, and you demonstrate to us that you did, so 400,000 batteries for one and a million batteries for the other one, that's generating $10 billion in activity and probably $2 billion in taxes, new taxes generated every year, we'll let you keep some, up to $13 billion. It's different.
Okay, but hold on. You said $2 billion in taxes, but they get to keep 13
per year. So what their commitment is $13 billion over a long period of time that goes to 2032, but they're going to start generating $2 billion in revenue in 2025, and so it's a performance based incentive. it's based on new taxes that we will just forego. But
they're still going to be paying taxes.
Oh yeah, they'll definitely. So what'll happen is they'll do. So if you do 400,000 batteries a year, we'll take Stellantis, for example, in Windsor. They said they're going to do 400,000 batteries a year. We know those batteries are $25,000 each. Those batteries will go into vehicles in Windsor and in Brampton. So they'll generate an HST of 13%. So $10 billion of activity, generating $1.3 billion worth of HST. Then there's the corporate taxes that the company will pay and the personal income taxes of all the employees and the employers' contributions. We think that totals $2 billion a year. If they produce the batteries, they get the subsidy. That subsidy will come out of that extra $2 billion worth of taxes. If they don't, they won't. Now, the problem and the reason we're having a very public debate, Brian, is that we've gone out and struck these deals and then we crow about the deals, but we don't explain the second part. And so people quite rightly say, we're in kind of tough times. Everything's expensive. We got a lot of competing interests. You give $13 billion to who? And instead, if they took the time, if they found a way to consistently explain it like I did, which is if they build it and they generate new taxes, we will forgive some of those new taxes.
And it's about 25%, right?
You mean the subsidies were? Yeah, it's about that. Yeah, it's about that. And so you sit there and say, okay, well, that's a little bit different. You're making a bet with nothing down. Or little down. It's not nothing down. We did put $1 billion of public money, 500 from the feds, 500 from the province on that plant in Windsor. But, you're in the big leagues. There's always going to be a franchise fee. There's always going to be a payroll fee, but, you got to go out and win. And, we just do in my opinion, and I say this with respect to my friends at Queen's Park and in Ottawa, sometimes we spend more time announcing and crowing about a deal than doing the careful, thoughtful explanation to the people who pay the taxes on why there's going to be a return and what we use that return for. Those are communities with a healthy economic industrial basin who then pay for the things that tax base pays for the things that are important in those communities: schools, hospitals, roads. A city like St. Thomas saw two major plants leave in 2008 and 2010. It's a ghost town. If I owned a house in St. Thomas, what do you think the value of my house was then? And if I had a mortgage on a house that was $300,000 and then my mortgage was $250,000, but the cost of the house, the price of the house, the value dropped down to $200,000 on renewal, I lose the house.
Okay, but your critics would say that at the end of all this, it works out to $4 million per job.
The critics aren't in the business or even in business. You never do a per job calculation. You turn around and say, take the Honda one, for example. You put $5 billion of public money into a $15 billion investment by Honda. If that $15 billion investment produces an extra $2 billion a year in taxes, in tax revenue, like we talked about, it's how long do we go before you get your $5 billion back? In that case, less than 3 years of full production. It's not we never have the jobs argument in AI. We never have the job, like cost per jobs in healthcare. We just say, okay, what's your return on investment? Automotive is an easy target because we've had cycles, decade-long cycles of boom and bust. The automakers are not Canadian based. You don't have a Canadian CEO of Canada Motors that you can take to task. And I think people are a little bit jaded, and rightfully so, that they've seen government investments in automotive in the past. And then that company says, oh, well, we got tough times and we're out, and chase us. What we learned from that, and I was involved in some of those deals, as you know, I worked in government in an earlier chapter of my life. We learned that we don't flow money against a promise. We flow money against performance. Bring me the receipts, show me, and then we'll give you the credit against it. So you're giving them a tax break, rather than giving them money up front. Yeah, and if you give them money up front, not you, but the government. Yeah, and if you give them money up front, what you do is you get first charge against the asset. I'll get first charge against the plant. I'll get first charge against your tooling. And yeah, I'm not going to be able to recover all of it. But you're not going to be able to borrow against it. And it's a bigger bet that, a more sure bet, by government. We're all learning, while the Chinese and others, not just the Chinese, but others are at full sprint. And, I'll take, for example, the Vietnamese have a car company now. When we were negotiating the TPP in 2015 and 16, everybody said to me, because I was saying, why are we letting the Vietnamese and the Malaysians into a deal tariff-free that could sell their goods to us? Well, what do the Vietnamese sell to us? They're not a threat. I said, I know they're a threat. They have a manufacturing culture. They are one of the world's, supply chains in commoditized goods. These are earnest people who want to join the world stage. Well, the biggest noodle maker in Vietnam decided to put his fortune with an equal bet from the federal government to build a company called VinFast. And now you can go to Yorkdale Shopping Center and buy a VinFast. Not one stitch in that car is Canadian. They're all EVs. The federal government's giving them a $20,000 credit for everyone they sell here. Do you have to sell at a profit when you sell a $50,000 or $60,000 car that gets a $20,000 credit?
That's your profit, is what the Trudeau government's giving you.
Yeah, and look, it's a pen stroke away from fixing it. You just say, no, you're not going to give that credit, or you're not going to require local manufacturers to buy one. Then that just turns, VinFast's credit into nothing. You go buy a VinFast, beautiful cars, by the way. This is not a criticism of the company. They went and got Ferrari's designer, Pininfarina, to make them. If you get a $5,000 purchase incentive from the feds, it's easier for you to buy it. We're all kind of struggling for how to make ends meet. Great, but we just sent that $5,000 to Vietnam.
But you, the consumer, gets $5,000, and then the company gets $20,000.
Yeah.
Why do they have to worry about having a high price?
Yeah. So now you're an auto worker. Let's forget about me. Who cares who I am? You're working in a plant in Windsor or Brampton or Oakville or Oshawa, and you've got a good job. Maybe you and your partner work in the plant or work in the business, and you have a dual income where, you're pulling in $180,000, $200,000 a year with overtime, like really, really, usable material wages. And you are in a plant. The Canadian plants have gotten 38% of the J.D. Power's productivity and quality awards since the late 90s, and we have maybe 11% of production. These are people who are doing a super job. And you find out that the government's got a side door open that allows the Chinese to flood the market to you and your neighbors to buy their goods with workers that in some cases are forced labor, but when they're not forced, they get $5-6 an hour, treated like garbage. People who cynically, a country that cynically doesn't care about the environment locally, domestically, when they want to build their global hegemony, but preach it to Canadians. And you're going to lose your job to that. And don't you want your government to fight for your job? Well, we're doing a great job on the investment side, but we left the door wide open on this mandate credit side.
Should Canada follow the Biden government's path and do the tariff?
Should have done it yesterday. We really don't have an option. We should have done it anyway. Regardless of what the U.S. are doing. The U.S. had a 27.5% tariff. All we had was a 6.1% most favored nation WTO tariff. I went down in the first week of November. So we spoke in Ottawa in October. Then in November we went down and spoke to White House, Treasury, Energy, Transportation, and said, the Chinese are coming. You should know that the Chinese imports into Mexico next door to you went up 400% last year. In Europe, 330%. They you have a bunch of doors that are open. You better close them fast. Then we spoke about it publicly. Then I spoke about it to the press and at a conference, caused a major kerfuffle. I got a lot of people who don't like me, who are in Mexico and or in the U.S. relying on Chinese supply chains. I was the happiest person in this country when I saw what the Biden administration did a couple days ago. It doesn't mean you can't buy a BYD, whatever that car, whatever that model is called. It just means that you can't buy it for $15,000. It means that you have to pay $30,000 for it. And it's all relative. It's still $10,000 cheaper than the average vehicle in the U.S., but it's got to hurt a little bit. That $15,000 is tariff tax revenue collected by the U.S. government that maybe helps to pay that $330 billion they're investing in domestic EVs. I love when people so boldly say, you should be fine with some competition. And this is about the environment. Well, they don't play by the rules over there. Don't be naive.
Yeah. Flavio, talking about putting big tariffs on things kind of makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'm a free trade kind of guy, but you can't be doing free trade with a country that has their government subsidize their industry so that they can become the dominant player, or that does not have the same labor standards or environmental standards. Otherwise, we're tying our hands behind our backs and asking our workers to pay the price. And that's not a good outcome.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even have to say anything. You just said the whole thing. Like it is, you make the major leagues, you're on a roster, you're pitching against the lineup that you say, okay, look, I got to be better than the hitter, and let the best player, let the best team win, and then you lose, and then you find out that team was recording the pitches and making noises in the dugout to make sure that they knew what was coming, and they cheated, and they win the World Series, and they're the Houston Astros in 2017.
I was going to say, Houston? You're talking about Houston?
Yeah, and Houston gets to keep the trophy, because Major League Baseball said the only way we're going to find out about it is if we give people immunity, and then they'll confess to us. They did. Well, if you lost to Houston in that series, you don't have a World Series ring. The integrity of the game is greatly diminished, and you can no longer say the game is a balanced free market to play like we pretend the auto market is. The Chinese are the 2017 Houston Astros. And when you buy their cars, they win. When they buy our market share, they win. But we don't have to wait for an investigation. We know. So if you want to do it, if you say, if the government here or the market here or environmentalists here say what's more important is climate, and the air over the roads in Lethbridge and in Trois-Rivières must be clean, and that you can close your eyes to the fact that there is no wall on the borders of this country, that we all share the same atmosphere, then have at it. But it's a luxury to be that naive. I mean, I certainly am not. And I sit here talking on behalf of the automotive sector. I mean, before this, I was building utility-sized solar power plants. We developed the third biggest solar power plant in Canada. Some of the other work that I'm involved in is in the circular economy, resource recovery, turning what was garbage into fuel, into materials that store energy. I do know in all those enterprises, including Project Arrow, that in Canada, if you can't turn a profit on a project or on a company, you can't get a lender, you can't get a customer, you can't get an investor. And so you can't say it's, that there's this false choice. It's only the economy or only the environment. You got to make it work. In China, they prey on our naivete and say, "Oh, what can help you achieve that objective? Here, just
sign up for our cheap products."
Yeah, while our air continues to belch with the new coal-fired plants you helped us set up.
Flavio, thanks for the time as always.
Anytime, Brian.
Thanks for listening today. Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music is by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. You can subscribe to Full Comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast. Please hit that subscribe button. Listen through your Alexa-enabled devices or other devices that you've got around your home. Help us out by giving us a rating or leaving a review, and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.